Hello. I haven't found any more old Lifeboat films for a while, but I did come across this old Lifeboat book recently, titled Launch. Published in 1932 and written by General Seeley, it has certainly been an interesting read. It led me on a path of discovery regarding the author and the station where he was a volunteer. He was born in 1868 and joined the crew of the Brook lifeboat on the Isle of Wight in 1894, aged just 26, and he'd served for 38 years by the time this book was published. It's not surprising he joined the Brook crew, as with a little research I discovered that his father was the incredibly wealthy Victorian industrialist Charles Seeley, who, by 1900 according to Wikipedia, owned family estates that covered almost half the west side of the island. Brook Lifeboat Station was located at Brook Chine on the southwest coast of the island. It opened in 1860 and closed in 1937. As far as I can discover, it must have been one of the last stations to use a team of horses to launch the lifeboat. Judging by the costumes in these photographs and the summer crowds, I wonder if these were taken at some kind of celebratory final launch. At the time of Seeley's service, the lifeboat was the 34-foot, self-righting, pulling and sailing lifeboat William Slaney Lewis. In 1907, it was replaced by the 35-foot pulling and sailing lifeboat, the Susan Ashley. Incidentally, a later lifeboat of that name is featured in an old lifeboat film on this channel called Bequest to a Village. Well worth watching if you've not seen it already. That Watson-class lifeboat in itself is now on permanent display at the Lifeboat Collection in Chatham Dockyard. After doing a bit of research, I discovered that Seeley had the most amazing life beyond his lifeboat service. He was a close friend of Winston Churchill, and despite being the Secretary of State for War in the 2 years preceding World War I, John Seeley spent almost the entirety of the war on the front line. Known to his soldiers as General Jack, he became best known for leading his horse Warrior into a huge cavalry charge at Moray Wood. He later wrote a further book in 1934 about these exploits called My Horse Warrior. This book eventually became the inspiration for the theatre play and Spielberg film Warhorse. Seeley somehow combined his military service with one in politics, becoming the Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight from 1900 to 1906. He then joined the Liberal Party and served in 2 further seats before being re-elected as the Liberal MP for the Isle of Wight in 1923. He became Lord Mottiston in 1933 following his appointment to the House of Lords, and he died in 1947. Quite how he had time to be a member of a lifeboat crew at the same as doing all this, I've no idea. But he did, and he did take part in some launches. Having read this book, I can honestly say that General Seeley writes very well, and in order to give you a flavour of that, I asked a friend of mine to narrate a few passages for you. These passages give quite a vivid description of some of the experiences of early lifeboat crews and the incredible courage, endurance and fortitude they displayed.
The story of this launch is worth telling. I was riding home over the downs on this Sunday evening when I heard clearly the unmistakable sound of the lifeboat maroon. I had been listening to the loud roar of the sea, which was 2 miles away, as I rode, and knew, of course, that any vessel in distress would have a bad time if it approached our coast. But I galloped as hard as I could to my home, and in a few minutes was talking on the telephone to the coxswain of our lifeboat, because a wireless message had come from a steamship, by name Rumelian, that she had been in collision, was making water fast, had 56 crew and passengers on board and was approaching the Needles Channel and required assistance to find her way in. I said, "Fire the gun," and within a few minutes I heard the loud detonation of our maroon. Then I started for the lifeboat house. We waited impatiently for the horses. At last they came. The boat was hauled out of its house and down to the beach. The sand was soft and the beach was rough, but at last we got her far enough into the water to make it probable that she would slide off her carriage into sufficient deep water to enable us to get clear. But we had to wait for 2 big waves to coincide to give us the depth of water required. As we waited, my son came dashing into the water to shout that the vessel was moving towards the Needles, but was sinking fast. There was no time to lose, but nevertheless, that big surge had come to give us water enough to launch with success. In a moment, the double wave came and we were off. The lifeboat was launched on service under the depressing conditions of a dense fog, pouring rain, and a heavy ground sea. I say depressing because the absence of wind made it certain that we must do the whole service with oars. Our lifeboats are very heavy. The design of their hull is such that if all 10 oars pull really hard, they can be propelled through the water at a surprising speed. But it is very hard work, and one prays for wind, except a violent gale dead on shore, when one hears the signal gun. We pulled harder than I have ever known our boat to be pulled before. It is recorded that we covered 4¼ miles in 40 minutes. Then all at once, but only for a moment, as sometimes happens, the rain redoubled in intensity and the fog drifted away. We could see that there was no vessel between us and the Needles, 2½ miles away. We pulled into the signal station and, taking all risks, got within 30 yards of the cliff. Above the roar of the sea, we managed to catch the words of the Coast Guard, 100 feet above us, shouting that the vessel, with her bow under water, was steaming up the Needles Channel with the Yarmouth lifeboat in attendance. We pulled quickly out to sea because we were much too near to the rocks. I hope, indeed I believe, that we were all glad that the 56 souls had a good chance of safety. But I should not be telling the truth if I did not admit that we were all bitterly disappointed that we had just failed to reach her off our own coast. And so, somewhat crestfallen and rather exhausted, we pulled home against the tide. But we cheered up on the way home, got her nicely up the beach on a big sea, and after some difficulty in the inky darkness, got the boat safely housed just before midnight. It takes 10 horses to pull our lifeboat from the beach up the lifeboat road. And with the help of all the village, men, women and children, this difficult problem of moving a heavy boat, with all the wheels constantly further embedded by the rush of the sea through the spokes and far beyond, was solved. I have told this story, although there is no dramatic achievement in it, because it illustrates the response which is instantly made by everyone to the sound of the lifeboat gun. It is wonderful to see the unquestioning obedience of all concerned to what they conceive to be a call of duty. It would not occur to any of them to think that they were doing anything noble or fine. A strange thing is that the horses, a very essential part of our service, seem to be imbued with the same spirit, as all the carters will tell you. The darkness, the occasional bright flash of the flare, the roar of the sea, and the cold water washing around their legs must be strange and terrifying to them. But they understand that a great effort is required of them, and although they tremble, they obey the voice of their carter better than at the plough. It is fine to see them standing there, waiting for the moment when they make the supreme effort to start the boat. And then every one of them bending forward, digging their feet into the sand, half falling forward with the tremendous power which in those brief seconds they exert. No doubt they too, in some strange way which we do not understand, know that here is a moment when the heart must not fail.
Well, that passage gives you a good description of the tremendous collective effort required by men, women and horses to launch a rowing lifeboat over 100 years ago. Incidentally, the clip near the end of that passage comes from a short Pathé newsreel from 1933, marking the last horse-drawn launch of the Brook lifeboat. A link to the full video is in the description. Occasionally, even in the most dangerous of conditions, a lifeboat rescue can involve moments that, if not actually comedic, are certainly bizarre, as this next passage from the book describes.
After a rescue has been made by a lifeboat, the gratitude of the survivors is most touching and is constantly, or so it seems to us lifeboatmen, far beyond the merits of the affair. But the behaviour of the rescued at the crisis of relief, although most always unselfish and courageous, is curious and even comic. Looking back on these episodes, I see that the reason is that the passengers and crew of the sinking vessel can hardly believe that it is sensible to leave so big a vessel for another so tiny, in comparison almost microscopic. At the risk of offending an old friend, happily still alive after more than 40 years of lifeboat service, I must tell a true story of the rescue of a lady passenger with her baby by the lifeboat to which I belong some years ago. The chief carpenter in our neighbourhood, and a wonderful carpenter he is too, was one of the 3 brothers belonging to our lifeboat crew. In a very heavy sea, the lifeboat reached the wreck. The grapnel was thrown into the rigging and the lifeboat lay alongside. The great waves lifted the boat sometimes level with the rail of the ship, but as each wave passed, the lifeboat would drop 15 to 20 feet down her side. The problem of getting the people to jump into the boat at the right moment was difficult in the extreme. Many of them jumped at the right moment and were safely stowed between the thwarts. The crew on the side nearest the ship would catch them as they jumped, while the 5 oarsmen on the further side manoeuvred with their oars to help keeping the lifeboat from crashing against the ship. My friend the carpenter on the side nearest the ship, who had called a number of men as they jumped at the top of the wave, to his astonishment, as the boat rose for about the 20th time, saw a handsome young lady with a baby in her arms standing by the rail. Then this quaint conversation ensued. He shouted, "Jump, ma'am!" But she had not time, nor did she seem ready to jump. As the boat disappeared, he heard her voice saying, "Am I to trust myself to you?" The lifeboat rose level with the deck again, and he said, "Yes, ma'am, throw me the baby for a start." She answered, "No, I will stick to my baby. Can I trust you?" But down went the boat again. A brief interval, and my friend the carpenter showed his face at the deck level and shouted, "I'm a family man with 2 children. Come along, ma'am." And she replied with these astonishing words, "Well, you look like a respectable man and I will trust you. But can you promise me we shan't get wet with the baby's best clothes?" On the next appearance of the lifeboat, it crashed against the side of the ship, and our gallant carpenter grabbed the lady and baby and hauled them into the boat. At that moment, the boat was cut adrift and the sea caught her broadside on. The next wave swept right over them. The lady in black satin and the baby held firmly in the arms of the carpenter. The lady said angrily when the water had cleared away, "I'm sure you are a respectable man, but I don't know what you mean by letting a wave break right over my baby. A spare oilskin was stretched over the lady and child, and after much difficulty they were landed in safety. The child lived through this ordeal, and each year the woman wrote to thank the coxswain, the crew and the carpenter for having saved her and her child.
Although the incident that General Seeley describes is over 100 years old, I am sure there are still occasions today when, in moments of extreme stress and mortal danger, those being rescued by a lifeboat probably say similarly inappropriate things. This last passage relates to another timeless observation made by Seeley. Lifeboats might have changed beyond all recognition since the time in which he wrote, but human nature and the behaviour of the crews are still the same. Teamwork, heroism, loyalty and sacrifice are still at the core of our lifeboat crews.
Perhaps the most surprising thing about the lifeboat service, and it is very surprising, is the effect it has in abating the anger, hatred and malice of mankind. I have been observing the phenomenon now for many years in different parts of the country, and I can truly say that wherever a lifeboat is stationed, all the great qualities of goodwill, good humour and unselfishness come by their own, and the bad qualities of envy, pettiness and unkindness tend to disappear. The lifeboat may be summoned on service only occasionally, but nevertheless the sense of responsibility is ever present to all minds. Every time the sea roars loudly as evening falls, every time the great cloud to seaward dissolves into mist which comes stealthily rolling over the sea, over the land and up to the hills beyond, everyone says to himself, perhaps unconsciously, "Tonight I may be needed." I know of a case before the late war where the discussions over Mr. Lloyd George had become so acute that two good men had refused ever to speak to each other again. This was embarrassing, because they were both leading men in the village and lived not far from one another. The vendetta was complete. The protagonists had only one encounter of personal violence and then relapsed into sullen opposition. But the children of both families were engaged in perpetual warfare. Then came a great storm and a shipwreck on the outer reef. The lifeboat maroon was fired, and at its sound the whole village rushed to the lifeboat house. Amongst them were the two champions of the radical and conservative causes. The tide was so high and the breaking seas so heavy that it seemed impossible to launch the boat. But this very fact made it certain that the vessel, whose flares of distress could clearly be seen through the darkness, must break up within an hour at most. The general opinion of the committee and the older fishermen was that to launch would be suicidal. The coxswain thought otherwise, and said in a loud voice in the shelter of the lifeboat house, "I am going to launch the boat if I can get enough chaps to come with me. Whatever the committee say, I call for volunteers." The Lloyd George man started to shout, "I am your man," but even as he spoke his opponent roared out, "I go with you." There was a cheer from the onlookers as the two shook hands. Enough were found to complete the crew. The launch was successful and the shipwrecked crew were saved. This is but one episode of many that I know of, where quarrels, bitternesses and even hatreds have been completely wiped away by a lifeboat launch. A curious thing happened during the late war. The smouldering fires dividing Great Britain and Northern Ireland from Ireland of the South, and the even more acute division between the two sections of Southern Ireland, broke out into a flame so vivid that it is true to say that in some respects the most cruel and heartless war that was waged in that merciless time was the war in Southern Ireland. And yet, during all that desperate time of rebellion, burning and massacre, where no common service could be carried on. Alone in this welter of conflict, the lifeboats of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution continued their work. Over and over again, men who were sworn to kill one another forgot their differences and manned the lifeboat. I have often wondered how it can be made possible for this beneficent healing influence of the common cause to spread throughout the land. In a great war, if the people believe the cause to be just, every household on both sides is fired with a common enthusiasm. Men, women and children do things and suffer things beyond ordinary human experience. Millions are exalted by the thought of common effort and common sacrifice. Baser men may take advantage of the moments to hide and enrich themselves, but the great majority are nerved to efforts and sacrifices of which no one previously would have deemed them capable. But the question is asked, and it is a question as old as the history of mankind. Can we not get the exaltation and the comradeship without the folly and futility of war? I do not find an answer to this age-long question except in one small instance. The lifeboat service provides it. It is but a small thing in the vast affairs of our country, but it is an example.
So there you have it. Launch, a book written by General Jack Seeley and published in 1932. In some ways of its time, and in some ways timeless.